Hello, YouTubers, friends, compatriots, rulers, sills, desolate, peasants, vassals, minions, propagandists. Oh, wait, that's me. I'm Useful Idiot. Welcome. And today I want to talk about Russia Today. And Russia Today is propaganda. And this is been a topic I've been wanting to cover for a long time for a number of reasons. The most recent of which, because it is this massive propaganda war that's going on between the United States and Russia today over the Ukraine. And I'm seeing distortions of the truth in Western media that are staggering, even in light of everything I've seen during my lifetime. And then all these outrageous statements by Western journalists and politicians who acknowledge Russia Today and are trying to involve discussions of Russia Today in this propaganda war. They're trying to drag it into this discussion. And it's memorable for me as well because I've had a number of battles on YouTube with trolls. One notably, a guy called Loudmouth Jerk, and he was a loudmouth jerk. And I'm somewhat of a loudmouth jerk myself, so we butted heads. But he was adamant about how Russia Today is evil and that we can't listen to anything on there because Putin will murder journalists. And I felt like he was pretty naive to think that journalists aren't murdered in the West all the time by governments. And at least the Russians are a little more honest about it. And then also some uber patriot channels. That there's one guy that has one of these super uber patriot channels. I think he's called Revolution R Us or something like that. And he has a whole playlist that's called Propaganda Today, where he highlights all the stories that Russia Today runs that are he considers propaganda. But I noticed he didn't have the same thing for liberal and conservative channels in the United States, the country he lives, where he is spoon-fed propaganda all the time. And so we have that, and then we also have like I say, we have these discussions in public all the time. Victoria Nuland, the Assistant Secretary of State, said recently that, quote, "We believe in freedom of speech and freedom of media in this country, in the U.S." And she said that people aren't interested in what's on Russia Today because they're more interested in the, quote, "dynamic, truthful opinion," unquote, of U.S. media. And then we also had, of course, Hillary Clinton talking about the war of information and pointing out that she watched Russia Today and found it very educational, very well put by her. I'm sure it was quite an education. See all her dirty laundry as well as a lot of United States dirty laundry aired on Russia Today. And hilarious that Victoria Nuland's getting out there and talking about the dynamic, truthful nature of Western U.S. media and using that as an example of why to tear down Russia Today. And then recently we had an EU summit resolution with the Council of Europe. And a spokesman said, quote, "I want to give a message of warning to politicians and journalists who sometimes repeat ideas they pick up from Russia Today and other channels," unquote. So here, once again, we find governments in Europe, along with the United States, talking about Russia Today and wanting to censor the information and condemning it as propaganda when all these very same countries have their own propaganda mechanisms. And good example of that is this EU summit resolution talking about countering Russian disinformation campaigns and supporting media freedom and European values in Russia. So in other words, to counter so-called Russian propaganda, it's not enough that we've had all these other Western programs for decades spreading Western ideas throughout Russia and its previous empire. But now, to counter that, of course, we're going to have more mechanisms in Europe to supposedly spread these Western values in Russia. And then we also have Russia Today being investigated by media regulators, Ofcom, over anti-Western comments in a late-night discussion on Ukraine. And apparently this group has 6 ongoing inquiries into Russia Today, responding to complaints. And of course, as everyone pointed out, the complaints are coming from CIA operatives. And it was this show Crosstalk where they just have a bunch of people discussing. I find that also very humorous. They get complaints because you could watch any of the so-called roundtable discussions going on in Western media right now discussing Russia, and to say that they would be anti-Russian would be an understatement. So anyway, we have, and then related also, we have several incidents that have happened recently where, as far as propaganda, where we had a German journalist who came out and revealed how much of the Western news is developed and spoon-fed to them by the CIA. We have the chief political commentator of the Telegraph resign from the paper because they wouldn't publish information about HSBC, which is a criminal bank, because they were concerned about advertising revenue. We have Israeli pressure on media all over the globe, of course, to support their agenda. Then we have French journalists who revealed posthumously that he and many others in French media were paid by Israeli secret services to support Israeli media. So those are all kind of sub-stories that have come out recently that support this whole idea that everyone is involved in a propaganda war on a global scale, and to single out Russia Today as somehow better or worse than any other is an interesting discussion. So, of course, I want to discuss it in the context of just propaganda in general. So, propaganda, of course, is to influence, to create influence, information, and thought, and to spread or propagate. The base of the word is to spread or propagate, and it hasn't always had a negative connotation. And in fact, previous to the 19th and 20th century, it was just known as spreading or propagating information. And in fact, public relations was actually referred in the United States as it was referred to as propaganda up to World War II, interestingly enough. But propaganda, of course, can have negative effects because it presents facts selectively and can lie by omission. And if you look at the basic elements of propaganda in that light, certainly all media across the globe, and in fact all information and promotion and advertising by all corporations, all government, and all entities, including individuals, to some degree becomes propaganda. And we only attach a negative connotation, of course, whether we agree with it or not. And that's the bottom line with Russia Today and everything else, I think. Certainly there's plenty in the so-called liberty movement, Tea Party movement, even the liberal left, people all over the country in the United States who would respond to a lot of the stories on Russia Today because it resonates with them, but then they turn around and disagree with certain other elements. And I would say that was true of United States media as well, I would hope. But like I say, we have all these different kinds of propaganda: religious propaganda, corporate propaganda, wartime propaganda. And Americans don't seem to mind a lot of their own propaganda. And in fact, Americans, of course, are very brand conscious. Corporate propaganda they've fully embraced, and even have their favorite commercials. And then if you even look at another analysis of propaganda that one can use to apply here is the discussion there's 3 different types of propaganda: white, gray, and black. In white, it's propaganda where the source is disclosed and you can decide for yourself based on the source whether it's true. You have gray propaganda, which is ambiguous and has ambiguous sources, and that's mostly what we see in the world. And then so-called black propaganda, which is supplied by the enemy and it has a lack of sources. And we see this all the time in both Western and Russian media and all the media around the world. And as most of my viewers certainly know, a lot of this is all based on the work of going back to Edward Bernays, who developed mass consumer advertising manipulation of public opinion, worked for corporations and then worked for governments, and had connections to his family member Sigmund Freud, applying the same methods. And encourage anyone who's not familiar with his work to look it up, because it has a lot to do with this. But certainly propaganda became negative in the 19th and 20th centuries with war demonization, which reached new levels during World War I, and also the use of propaganda systemically by the state in Nazi Germany and Stalinist Russia, and not to mention the fact that there's this kinship with propaganda and censorship. Let's remember that as well. As I mentioned earlier, propaganda can have a lot to do with lying by omission or choosing selectively, and it becomes clear that it has this relationship to censorship, and censorship can be done in different ways. One only has to look at the different ways that the dystopian future was depicted by Huxley and Orwell. In one scenario, you're censored, you don't get any information. In the other scenario, you get too much information, you get overloaded. And I would suggest in this modern world, we're living in an era side by side. There's both censorship and blocking of all sorts of information, but we also have this saturation. And certainly anybody that's involved in the alternative media and is interested in these things find themselves bogged down in a massive amount of information almost every single day. So let's get back to propaganda in general. In the U.S., of course, we have corporations who create, buy, and build all these media outlets. So to talk about, with 6 companies owning most of the media in the United States, so when people try to compare Russia to today as some corporate-controlled entity, and therefore everything on it is propaganda, it gets pretty laughable when you compare it to the United States media outlets, where corporations own everything and are in complete collusion with the government and their policies. And one only has to see the way the U.S. media colludes in all of our these pro-war scenarios. Almost all the media is pro-war and has been for quite some time. And in fact, attached below a documentary by Danny Schechter, rest in peace, died this last week, documentary about the collusion of U.S. media in the selling of the Iraq War, and no one can deny that. And we see the same things operative in U.S. media right now, and so they represent their own corporate interests, and then they represent the interests of their parent companies, which are all involved in the military-industrial complex. And then we have a Congress and a government that's heavily invested in both these media and military-industrial complexes. So all their interests coincide in perpetrating these wars and having this propaganda media, and then they sell this media influence as well, sell this advertising. So we have layers and layers and layers of propaganda. Anybody who watches a national football game sees layers and layers of military, sports, and corporate consumer propaganda, and not to mention that infotainment, all the media in the United States is infotainment, which is a special brand of propaganda in itself, because it mixes gets these mixed signals of news with being entertained, so feeling good about feeling bad. And so, like I say, we have omissions and distortions and emphasis and all these subtle ways that propaganda is used. And that's another thing. I would hope anyone who watches any of these media outlets and any of these news, whether it's Russia Today or anyone else, your first clue is the headlines. You'll get part of the agenda, and then you can take the information itself and decide from that, just as you would in U.S. media. But and another thing is this is nothing new. This collusion between the media, we see this historically throughout the world, in Russian history and European history and United States history. We've seen it more recently in the Iraq War and current war drum beating, but it also goes back to the Spanish-American War as a good example of American history. The newspaper, the Hearst newspapers, practically created that war, and that war almost existed almost only in newspapers. Anyway, so let's go back to Russia today. Let's go over a little bit of history. They started in 2005, and they're state-monitored and funded news outlets. So that seems to sustain Abby Martin's claim that there's a certain amount of editorial leeway that they have on Russia today. But of course, all they have to do is make sure they hire people who are critical of the United States, and that helps that they don't have to have much editorial control. Russia states that its purpose is to create a positive image of Russia abroad. And certainly the United States uses media the same way to do the same thing and justify a lot of NGOs and a lot of intervention in places like Ukraine, and justify it by trying to create a positive image of the United States abroad. And a long history with Radio Free Europe and just broadcasting propaganda devised material all across Europe during the Cold War. But we have all these kind of outlets all over the world presenting different views to balance out the fact that it used to be a Western-centric view of the world, particularly United States media-centric view of the world. But now we have Al Jazeera representing a certain Saudi Arabian, United Arab Emirates version of the Middle East and global events, Press TV out of Iran. We have the BBC and Guardian, and Fox News in the United States, even though it's not connected with the government. It certainly has a lot of connections with the neocon movement and the Project for a New American Century and support of Israel. Although they have, I have to admit, they've been charting an interesting course lately from their worst days back during the Bush administration. So anyway, we have Russia Today being broadcast in English, Spanish, and Arabic, and critics, of course, point out that they don't focus on what's going on in Russia and tend to focus in on the world, which is kind of a nice balance because the United States media, of course, is very oriented towards domestic consumption, and international news doesn't get very much coverage, and that's the way Americans like it, and that's the way the American government likes it. So a lot of times you get a lot of great international coverage from these foreign outlets, even though they're laced certainly with propaganda, much the way you get it from the United States. I find it rather interesting actually to watch a certain amount of American mainstream media and then look at all these propaganda outlets from all over the world. And somewhere in the middle you're going to discern what the real facts and what is of value and what is not, and what the particular agenda is of how it is presented. Even the Wikipedia page that you source a lot of times for just basic information has become a propaganda tool. So it is everywhere you turn, and this is just how it's going to be. You have to be savvy. So anyway, Russia Today, of course, is it's characterized by unrelenting coverage of corruption in the West, but none of its own. And the U.S. media reveals some Russian corruption, but can't reveal most because it involves U.S. companies. And so that's pretty ironic, but certainly true that Russia Today focuses in on America's dirty laundry, and that's just how it's going to be. The United States media generally is not going to cover it, and so Russia Today will. And just the same with the United States will air out all of Russia's dirty laundry, and domestic consumption will not get it as much. That's what everybody does. So to single out Russia is somehow diabolical and evil because they do that. It's not necessarily all that fair. And I would say that just everyone should just analyze Russia Today as they do all media sources. It always sounds like the truth when you agree with it. And so to dismiss Russia Today out of hand is pretty unfortunate. throwing the baby out with the bathwater, because Russia Today actually provides pretty unprecedented international news, and anyone that spends any time there knows that. We certainly had unprecedented access to the Ukraine war and other events across the Middle East, and my hat's off to them for that. And I just assume that, like all other media outlets, they are going to be propaganda. I know when I'm being manipulated, and I know when I'm just discerning facts. And same thing I get out of the alternative media. Ironically, a lot of in the alternative media talk about the propaganda of Russia Today, and even alternative media is propaganda. A lot of people out there promoting their media empires. They're selling silver and gold. They're selling fear. They're building up their subscriptions. They're taking PayPal donations. So everybody has got their angle. Even I have my angle. I'd like more people to watch me, but I really don't know why. I'm certainly not getting anything out of it other than the satisfaction of having one of the most savvy and educated bunch of subscribers on YouTube. But I digress. So anyway, interestingly, Russia Today takes sides of stories that have much in common with a lot of people in the United States, like myself, who want to see drastic changes in the world, including problems with the surveillance state and the police state and corporate government partnerships and the empire and perpetual war and the rest. So it turns out that we have just another media outlet that will give us more information, and I don't think anybody should see it as any more than that. So to dismiss Russia Today as propaganda is a moot point. And I'll finish up with a really good expression of just what I'm talking about from a gentleman named Joel Harding. And he is now running the United States program of disinformation in Ukraine right now, U.S. military special forces in PSYOPs and that sort of thing. But ironically, in 2012, just 3 years ago, he had a different take on things, and I'm going to read from Joel Harding. And he said that, quote, "These experiences caused me to think, and then I began to wonder how much of what we read and what we see is propaganda, not foreign but domestic propaganda. How much of that domestic information is propaganda? We are being smothered in one lie after another, all in the name of politics. It seems to me these politicians are complacent with us behaving like suckling pigs, absolute ignorant morons. Free, unfettered, uncensored information exposes the lies of their governments, and they prefer to feed them, allowing citizens to know and understand truth. For now, authority uses all kinds of filters for the truth." So I ask you, do you see more lies and propaganda here in the U.S. than I saw in China and Russia? I would say it depends on your perspective. I see more lies aimed at us from our own politicians than I ever saw in any place in the world. You tell me, are Americans more susceptible to propaganda? Unquote. Another question for another video. I'm a useful idiot. Don't you be one too.